So, our objectives for this webinar are pretty simple and pretty straightforward. The survivor stories are super important to us to understand as much as we can about sexual abuse so that we can understand more how we can help prevent it from happening at all, and also to prevent the ongoing trauma associated with sexual abuse. While our helpline is primarily here to help adults looking to respond early to warning signs of sexual abuse, to plan for safety before there are even any warning signs, we've always heard from survivors. We were founded by a survivor. This past year, nearly 8% of all the contacts receiving help for a personal situation were from people identifying as an adult survivor. And of those, 76% had not reported to any authorities. As many of you know, disclosure rates generally are low, and nationwide we talk about estimates of only 38% of victims ever disclose at all, and many not until they're adults. We know that, of course, sexual abuse is an adverse childhood experience, and that the impact of abuse can last a lifetime, impacting health and well-being in every way. So this webinar is to share some of those stories from the survivors that reach out to us, so that while every survivor story is unique and personal, we pay homage to the questions, the challenges, the concerns that they have. We'll share some thoughts about what survivors need and what responses are helpful, but primarily we're seeking to do what's always been important to us: move the unspeakable into the speakable, bringing awareness to sexual abuse and to survivors.
So the questions that we get from survivors really are just about as diverse as they are, but what's up on your screen right now are the most common general needs that we hear. Some of these can really pull at your heartstrings, right? Folks are sharing years of struggles with trust, relationships, mental health, overall well-being, difficulties with jobs, families, and partners. We've had people wonder if they're gay because of their own abuse history. We've had folks share stories of chronic psychiatric and physical disabilities. We've also heard stories of generational and intrafamilial abuse, and we've talked with survivors of online commercial exploitation. So, we're not going to address all of these here today, but our goal is, as it is with any of our helpline users, is really to help people find their voice and to feel less isolated, to feel less scared and more informed about their own choices in whatever next steps they want to take. And I just also want to add here that for many survivors, the predominant need actually isn't around the legal system, though we certainly do hear inquiries about reporting and pressing charges. But this is something that we'll be touching upon just a bit later.
Great, thanks, Micah. And so now we're really excited. We get to introduce our expert who's going to help us share these stories and think a little more deeply about these experiences and the impact of sexual abuse. Jackie Humphreys, a licensed social worker, is a therapist in private practice treating children, teens, and adults impacted by sexual abuse and other traumas. She is the mental health consultant to the Franklin County and North Quabbin Children's Advocacy Center in Massachusetts, and also to Time to Tell, a child sexual abuse prevention project. She serves on the board of Valuing Our Children, also in Massachusetts, and prior to becoming a therapist, she was the coordinator of the child abuse unit at the Northwestern DA's office, again in Mass. Jackie has had over 30 years experience working in the field of trauma. Jackie's passion and commitment to preventing and healing trauma is rooted in her own recovery from complex trauma, including child sexual abuse. And finally, Jackie was also involved in Stop It Now's early work, the Dialogue projects, where survivors and adults who had sexually abused a child came together for public conversations. Jackie, thank you so much for joining us. Is there anything else you'd like our audience to know about you? And you may be muted, or I may need to unmute you. So one moment, I think it's on me. There you go, Jackie. You should be unmuted. There you go.
Yes. Oh, great. Hi. Thank you, Jenny, and thank you, everybody, for showing up today for this really important conversation. I think the last thing that I'll say about me is that I'm coming to this conversation from several different places in my life. I'll be bringing my voice as a survivor, as a therapist, just as a human being, but I'm not in any way representing all survivors or all therapists. or all human beings. So that's the last thing I'd add to that.
Great. Thank you so much. We're so happy
Thanks
to have
so much, Jackie. And what's a webinar without a little technical snafus?
you. Yeah.
So let's begin with our first letter here. This one really illustrates the need that we hear from many survivors, which is the need to clarify and define what they experienced. This person wrote, when I was 10, my same-sex cousin who was 17 touched my privates multiple times over several years. Each time I was scared to death and just laid there unable to speak or move. That was over 40 years ago. I buried the memory, but recently it has popped up and it's haunting me. I don't know if I was sexually abused. I think so, but I'm unsure. Is that normal childhood play? So Jackie, is this familiar to you? Just the question of folks wondering about their own experiences.
Oh, absolutely. There is, as we know, most often child sexual abuse happens within a relationship that was once trusting and positive, and may still have aspects of that even after the abuse takes place. And then that relationship is violated. It causes such profound confusion, and we have to always remember that we're talking about children going through this. And I think as adults we can think about situations that have been confusing for us, but to really understand the intense emotional, cognitive, relational dissonance that comes from child sexual abuse can make it very difficult for survivors to understand what they've experienced. And I think also the secrecy that surrounds child sexual abuse also creates this a sort of a void of understanding for the survivor. So yes, it absolutely can be liberating to finally understand their experience. It can also really be devastating. Survivors, just one last thing, try to understand why they feel, think, act the way they do now, years later. Understanding your experience within the context of abuse can shed tremendous light on the questions that are lingering for you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jackie. I really appreciate that, just kind of holding in that, both realities of being confused and not knowing what to call it, and potentially having relief and both more questions from that.
Right.
So, while it's often clear, to us that abuse has taken place, to you as a professional, Jackie, or to those out here watching, when we think about just, regular folks out in the world, it's really easy to understand how it's possible to not know what to call an experience. We often hear questions like, my uncle used to watch pornography while babysitting me. Was this harmful? Was this abusive? Or my father used to walk in on me in the shower, peeking in all the time at me. Was I abused? And certainly questions about just behaviors between children can be even more confusing. So with more and more stories on the news about sexual abuse, more and more people are recognizing the incidents in their own life as abusive. And that certainly sheds more light onto folks really reflecting about their own experiences as children.
Yeah, absolutely, Mike. And I really appreciated, Jackie, what you said about that potentially freeing element of being able to not only reflect, but then get information that helps you define that experience so it doesn't feel as out of control any longer. So really helpful for us to understand. So let's move on to another letter. This person wrote, as a child from kindergarten up through 3rd grade, I was sexually abused by a member of my church. I told my mom, and instead of helping me, she ostracized me. She never got me help or stopped it from happening. I remember instances where during my childhood, my sister and I kissed and touched one another. My mother and father, upon realizing what happened, physically threatened me and became the dirty, nasty child. Though I'm older, this still haunts me. Oh, this is a difficult letter to read, and I can't even imagine the pain for the person who wrote this letter. And unfortunately, we just hear stories like this just too frequently on our helpline. But Jackie, is this frequent to what you see, that even though a child does take that courageous step and goes to a trusted adult, that they're not believed, or they're not listened to, they're not attended to? Do you see that a lot?
Well, I see it too much. That's for sure. I hear about it too much. And the first thing that I do is apologize that they were not believed, and I am also really explicit with them about me believing them, that I believe them, and I validate how difficult that must have been and still is. And absolutely, as you just said, I acknowledge the courage that it took for them to tell and reinforce the importance of them telling. And then I ask, what was the cost to them of not being believed? And you know, sometimes that's a good, that takes some time to really for them to really allow themselves to feel just how significant it was to not be believed or to be disregarded, dismissed. And you know, in this letter, to actually become the targeted child, to become the target of the parents' anger, and so, and it's also hard to ask or to hear a person say, I don't think that I did do the right thing. And again, that unpacking that is a long process. And I really just allow the opportunity, allow space to for them to talk about how they feel now about telling, and you know, all of the mixed feelings that accompany that.
Yeah, and I imagine, thank you so much for that, Jackie. And maybe you would agree with me here that part of the healing process, when you know someone does come to you and say, you know, no one believed me, might also be grieving their childhood as well.
Yeah, grief.
Deserved.
Yes, absolutely. I think grief is always a part of healing from trauma.
Absolutely. You know, we know that there are just so many barriers, Jackie, that any survivor, and any, particularly when we think about as a child, faces when deciding whether or not to tell anyone or whether to disclose. I mean, there are just so many barriers that people face when they've been sexually abused, and these same
Right.
feelings that have acted as barriers to talking with someone about what that person may have experienced in their youth follows them often into adulthood, still holding weight in their hearts and in their heads. And what everyone sees up on the screen are certainly just a small snippet of some of those distressing and confusing thoughts and feelings that people may have been faced with. And that's really a lot for a child, as you said earlier, to process on top of the abuse. And we focus on that a lot in our helpline, and I'm glad to hear that validated here, that people forget the child brain is looking at this situation with all of the loyalties, relationships, dependencies, and it can be so very confusing. So, you know, we need to pause and kind of honor these barriers, these walls. They're there for reasons, they're protective. And we know that the guilt of so many survivors is real, about, you know, that they feel that they didn't respond you know, often enough or loud enough, is deeply rooted in how they connect with themselves and with the world, really. Yeah, so let's hear another letter from you, Micah.
Thanks. Yeah, so really one of the devastating impacts of sexual abuse, and this is something that Jackie was just speaking of, is that a person, once they're an adult, they might start to reflect on the past and think that there might have been something they could have done differently or something they should have done, when there really was just so much out of their control. You know, children cannot be responsible to keep themselves safe. But certainly that self-blame is just all too common. Our letter writer is kind of feeling that now. She says, when I was around 12 years old, my dad fondled my breast and asked me if I played with myself and told me that he was the kind of kid who played with himself all the time. My mom didn't have a job, so my dad was our only source of income. So if he were put in jail, we would have starved. I'm 21 now, and I only recently told my mom what he had done. What should I have done as a child? We were entirely financially dependent on him, so I felt like I couldn't tell anyone or we'd end up without financial support. I'm only recently realizing how much his behavior affected me. And I really want to reflect here briefly that there are so many things that can get in the way of reporting, like Jenny said, just barriers that might come up. And sometimes that might be that the person themselves feel like they may be at risk of further abuse from the authorities. You know, and we know certainly that people of color and LGBTQ folks are more likely to be victims of sexual violence and to experience abuse by those in positions of power, including the police. There can be a lot of unspoken things that really go into a person's decision or not to report, and we don't fault anyone for making the choice that they did. There isn't always that one clear path that leads to the best outcome.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to ask you a question, Jackie, but I realized I first want to let our audience know that every email that we're using here has been given permission to us by the writer to use in our materials. We always change some identifying information, but we also really want to respect the wishes of folks who write in to hold their confidentiality or to generously share their stories so that others can feel supported and learn from that. So, so back to this letter, Jackie, you know, what is important for survivors to know about what they should have done? You know, is there something they should have done? And what can we say to people who are feeling like it's their fault because they didn't say something, they didn't tell anyone, or they didn't do anything to stop it?
Oh, yeah. It's so painful to hear that.
Yeah.
And I often hear it from older siblings, particularly when they discover that their younger siblings may have also been abused. Mike, I think you really summarized it well, that there, and the previous slide, that there are so many reasons, and there can be no judgment. There can absolutely be no judgment about what a person chose to do or not to do. When I'm working with survivors, I ask them to think about, and I'm sure other professionals who are online here probably do this, but ask them to think about when the abuse started, how old they were, how small, how afraid, confused they were. And think about a child that they know now who may be that age. And if that child was sitting next to them right now and told them what was happening, would they blame that child, or that they understand that the child was not able to tell? Would they blame that child for not telling? Inevitably, the answer is no. I wouldn't. If they have a niece or a nephew or a neighbor who's that age. But this is a process, and it's a process of understanding that if they could have told, they would have. I mean, I believe that with every cell in my body. And the fact that they didn't tell means they couldn't, for all of the reasons that we have talked about, and for a billion more. Survivors can only tell when they feel some degree of safety. And I think around this and other things that we'll be talking about, I think it's a lot less about what we may say and more about listening to the doubt, the fear, the shame. And often as survivors, in hearing ourselves, we find our own answers. And if professionals or others are so focused on changing a survivor's thoughts and feelings about what happened and whether they told or not, survivors are not going to feel validated and listened to and may shut down. And really what we want is for the shame, the self-blame, to be placed where it belongs, and for the survivor to come to their own recognition that it was not their fault, and to put the blame where it belongs.
Yeah, thank you. That's so important. I can imagine that holding on to that feeling that somehow you're to blame or didn't do enough can really be a barrier in your own recovery and healing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Thanks. Thanks so much, Jackie. Let's hear from another survivor. I was sexually abused by a family friend at age 5, and I'm now 23. This family friend is still around my family, and I'm worried about my 2-year-old sister's safety. My family never found out what happened. What can I do to protect my sister from this man? So, yeah, this is another fairly frequent and certainly really big question, very pressing, right? A person sexually abused a child previously, and now there's a concern that this individual is still interacting with or working with youth in some way to this day. And as you all read this letter, heard me read it, you'll see that, actually in this case, the identity of the person is a survivor. So we say, let's hear from a survivor, but in some ways, in this case, that's their secondary identification. Their primary question now is in the role of a bystander looking to keep another child, in this case, their sister, safe. And we know that actually for children and adults, this is one of the most more compelling reasons to disclose. The worry that the person who abused them will go on to abuse their sister or their brother or just another child in their lives. This is true also for adults who might never have told anyone what happened. It's the realization that there still could be a child at risk that begins to propel them to thinking about, how do I address this? It could be a child they know, like a sibling, or it might just be in general, for example, worried that the person who abused them now is in a position that brings them into contact with children regularly. Maybe they work at a school, or they are someone at their church, or they know that they work with children, in some sort of extracurricular arena. So a really heavy weight to carry, thinking about, do I have information? What do I do about someone that I think could harm others? So Jackie, what would you want a survivor to know about preventing sexual abuse in their family or their community moving forward, about protecting another child from abuse, or even their feelings that they're now in the role of a protector? What can we tell survivors in those roles?
Yeah. Boy, it's a really hard question. All your questions are hard, Jenny. And it's hard for a number of reasons, but one is, every situation is different. I think first is that the survivor, just as they could not hold the reality of being a victim of sexual abuse, hold that reality by themselves, holding this fear, this concern by themselves is not healthy, and it's also it may make it very difficult for them to actually find a path out. So I think the first thing that I would say is to find someone, of course, someone that they trust and feel safe with, to tell, and that if they don't get the initial response that they need, which belief and maybe an exploration of what could be done, to tell somebody else. That, you know, to recognize that they are not responsible for other people's behavior, but maybe by beginning to break open the secret, more and more people could be involved to actually take steps to protect other children from this family friend. But I think it's so important, they just recognizing that they can't do this on their own. And, you know, so calling places like Stop It Now, and other resources. So, you know, and if they don't have a friend or a family member that they could talk to, talking to a professional, a therapist maybe, or you and I have talked about children's advocacy centers as being a really great resource, and every state has a number of children's advocacy centers, and there's the website is nationalcac.org. So that's where I would begin.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that absolutely makes sense. And I think just really one of our own core belief systems in terms of just foundationally having allies to talk with is really important, having supports to lean on, because it certainly can be triggering when you're worried about another child's safety. And in that same respect, our answer can also be somewhat similar as it may be for any adult in kind of this bystander role. Like you said, we want to make sure that this child is in the safest environment possible. So we want to encourage folks to kind of just learn as much as they can about sexual abuse, about healthy sexuality development. We want folks to practice safety planning in their homes, working with partners and other involved adults. Making sure that everyone knows and practices these same rules for safety. And, you know, it also comes up that sometimes a person is worried that they're overreacting because of their own childhood experience of sexual abuse. And really our goal then is to support that person to trust themselves, to really validate their instinct and observations, and help them take steps necessary to respond to any risks in that child's environment. And that certainly can look different for different situations. And, you know, action steps of any kind really can just be so helpful, both for healing and for empowerment, you know, to feel validated, and stuff like that. And so when we can outline some concrete practical steps in these types of situations, really can help people who experience sexual abuse as children feel their own power and to help them prepare to take these steps. Jackie, is there anything you kind of wanted to add to that?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Was there anything else you wanted to add to what I was just saying, or?
I want to emphasize what you just said about every little act matters. So every act of protection matters. And again, I think another plug for Stop It Now. You have a website that is just, there's so much helpful information for people exactly in this position. So I think using that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. And I do just want to follow up on what you said, even in the previous slide, that we just cannot talk enough about nobody has to be alone. You know, whether
Right.
you are addressing your own experience, your own abuse, whether you are looking to protect your children, your family, or any of the other life activities that face you that specifically related to keeping yourself and the people that you love safe and healing and recovery. It's just isolation really is just so toxic. And I know it's so hard for folks to feel like they can reach out for help, but when we can clear that pathway for people to find a resource, to find information, to find support, then I just think that, you know, that's just key, really key in what we can do. It seems simple, and yet we all know it's not. It just
Right.
be hard. So thanks again.
Yeah. And just so you know, for some reason, I've lost the connection to the slide, so you're going to see me rejoining, but I can still hear you, so we'll just keep going.
That's great. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Okay. Yeah, so now we're just gonna turn to some of the questions we were talking about, formal steps, you know, those involving the criminal justice system. So this person said to us, when I was between the ages of 13 to 15 years old, I was sexually abused by my sports coach. Now that I've done the work and am strong enough, I want him locked up and I want him to pay for what he did. What are my first steps to pressing charges?
Well, sorry, I was making sure Jackie got back in. Yeah, so for some folks like that woman in our last letter, they are looking to seek justice. Giving these folks clear and actual information can be really helpful, and while preparing them to take next steps. So usually one of our key recommendations is that anyone thinking about taking a legal route, you know, they're thinking about talking to a lawyer, they're thinking about pressing charges. For them, they've come to that place where that's part of their healing process. We strongly recommend that those folks do have a professional, a therapist, to really support them behind the scenes, to think about, you know, how to prepare and to help them just in process, because certainly the process in the legal system can be, as we all know, really re-traumatizing. So Jackie, I'm wondering, you know, what kind of advice, guidance that you or any therapist can share, or any of us in a helping position can share to help prepare a client or a friend to speak to law enforcement or to press charges. And, you know, what can we do to really help that process not be yet another form of abuse for them or trauma?
Yeah. This is such a great question. I so appreciate that it's here. You know, I think really the first thing a therapist can do has to do with themselves, and that's to educate themselves about their local law enforcement and prosecution resources and practices. So really expanding and just sort of, you know, breaking down maybe some preconceived notions about the process and about who the people are who are involved in it, like police officers, prosecutors, but actually go meet people, go talk to the forensic interviewer, go talk to the state police detective, if you're in a rural area, who handles these cases. Talk to your local police department and find out who do they have that responds and that has been trained and responds to child sexual abuse allegations. And again, I want to go back to mentioning the children's advocacy centers.
Mm-hmm.
It's really a terrific resource for all of us, professionals and non-professionals. And then I think it's helping their client talk through their fears about going through a legal process, and taking their fears seriously. And, you know, I really appreciate what you were saying earlier, Micah, about, safety planning, you know, if you suspect that a child is being abused, safety planning for folks who have concerns about coming forward, really taking those seriously, and you know, both physical safety and emotional safety. So who are their resources? Who are the people in their lives that really believe, support, validate them? And if the child is, if the client is going to make a statement, suggest that they go with someone and have resources available afterwards, and to be very aware of what will happen next. So understand the investigation process, understand the prosecution process. What does it mean if it goes to grand jury? What does a pretrial hearing mean? What does it mean when, you know, the perpetrator is arraigned and they plead not guilty? And, you know, so really understanding the whole process. And I think also recognizing that the legal process, so often survivors may feel like the legal process is really where justice is going to happen. And sometimes there is the feeling that justice has occurred, and often there isn't, and through no fault, obviously, of the survivor, and also through no fault of the prosecution or the investigators. But you know, the process of submitting evidence, and particularly in these cases where, you know, typically there are no witnesses, typically the only evidence is one child's or adult's story. And so really recognizing that it is an opportunity to have your voice be heard, and then what? You know, and then letting go, actually needing to let go of the outcome, because the outcome doesn't always match the wishes of survivors. And I don't say that in any way to dissuade anyone from going forward, but, you know, I think it's very powerful. And I worked for 10 years in the DA's office, and I saw child after child after child testify and feel empowered. But we, as providers and supporters and allies, we also have to recognize where it may be really difficult. I'm not sure I answered your question, actually.
Well, I think you did, and beyond. I mean, I actually was sitting here thinking, oh, this could have been a whole webinar on its own. And in fact, I saw somebody say that they definitely want to listen to this again. And I'm feeling that I'm going to want to listen back to what you shared with us, because some of it is really practical information about what you can learn, because certainly being taken by surprise can be really jarring when you're already feeling nervous, edgy, it's a scary situation. But I think even more importantly are your points about kind of looking at your desired outcome and preparing for that outcome maybe not being what happens. And what does that mean about your healing? What does that mean moving forward? Right. What does it mean about your experience and validating it? I mean, for me, this just validates how important it is not to do this alone and to have support, because it's complicated and it's loaded. So I really appreciate what you said. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And yes, I think it actually makes me think, to be quite honest, that I can see Stop It Now needing to put together another tip sheet with some of these tips. And actually, just so I can touch on this, on our screen are just a couple of the resources that can be helpful, but they nowhere begin to scratch the surface a lot of what Jackie just said. we need to learn so much more. But I do want folks to know that they don't have to be alone. You know, the victim advocacy and support resources can help with some financial considerations. There are other resources that we have at Stop It Now and that are just out there in the world with, you know, great organizations like RAIN to help people do as much preparation as they can and to get as much support, whatever that support looks like. So great. So we're going to move on because, of course, we're watching the clock and there's just so much to say. And this next letter really, in so many ways, is at the crux of what we need to do to help survivors. And that is that question of how do I heal and if healing is possible. So this letter says, I'm a 25-year-old female and was sexually abused as a child by a stranger in the street at age 9. I've never talked about it. When it comes to dating, I get panicked and won't show up. It's made me feel so lonely and left out. I can't trust and I can't fit in relationships. I can't sleep or stop blaming myself. I feel the urgent need to talk to someone about it and I don't know what to do. And we do hear this question in so many forms. Sometimes someone's been working in therapy, other times they've never reached out or told anyone. And our helpline isn't a counseling resource, but we certainly recognize the importance of showing up for these folks with you know, particularly a warm and welcoming style and letting them know that they are indeed brave, that we believe them, that we see them as whole people who are not responsible for what happened to them, and that they have a right to support and healing. And we talk about strategies to help address how the abuse in their life has impacted them while encouraging them to work with an experienced therapist, one who works with adults who have been sexually abused. So Jackie, again, this is, of course, could be a whole day's seminar, but I'm just, you know, wondering what can we say to somebody when their question is, am I forever damaged, or is there hope for me to have a normal life with healthy relationships and maybe a family one day?
Well, I think I'm going to start this answer with one of my favorite quotes about healing. Although the world is full of suffering, it is full also of the overcoming of it. And that's was said by Helen Keller. And so, you know, I think the first thing that we want to do is we just want to say to that person who's saying, am I damaged forever? We want to say, no, of course not. You know, we want to like jump in and you know, pull them out of the well, right? But I think one of the most important aspects of my healing has been talking to other survivors. So hearing from other survivors about how they have gotten to where they are, how the spiral of healing looks to them, and what are the stops along the way that help them that maybe I could use. So I think finding survivors who hear it and know that worry, that feeling, that fear. I think also reading survivors' stories, reading, I mean, there's a lot of wonderful literature, anthologies, and also my friend and colleague Donna Jensen just published a book called Healing My Life, From Incest to Joy, and it's all about the ways in which she recovered, and it is not just surviving but thriving in her life. I think, again, as I said earlier, when we can hear our own voices, we can often find the answers. I think knowing that the voices that tell us that we're damaged and broken are the voices of shame, and it's shame that doesn't belong to us. It's never belonged to us. So those voices don't belong to us either. So find the voice that is seeking healing. And, you know, in this letter, I want to say, listen to that urgent need to talk to someone, and find that someone, find that trusting person. I think as we break the silence around it, we break open the shame. Shame does not like the light of day. It shrinks in the light of day. Mm-hmm. And so our voices around healing, our voices of empowerment, of worthiness, become louder and louder until they drown out the voice of shame.
Oh, I love how you said all that. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I do want to capture that to be able to share with others. So thank you. All right. Yeah. We're going to keep moving because we're watching our time.
Thanks, Jenny. You know, we really want to emphasize that a survivor's experience is impacted by all of who they are, right? By their culture, their race, their economic stability, and of course their gender. You know, and while we can't address the survivor experience from all of these today, unfortunately, we just don't have time. We do want to pause for a moment to think about the unique experience of male survivors, you know, predominantly because we do most frequently talk as if only females are sexually abused. A recent Helpline report revealed to us that almost a quarter of survivor contacts were male. And there certainly can be some challenges for them that may feel different. They can have an even more difficult time disclosing, and people may doubt their abuse or even hold their abusive experience as, you know, quote unquote, a boy's dream come true. You know, think, for example, of a female teacher sexually abusing a male teen versus the reaction when a male teacher sexually abuses a female teen. There are also concerns about being seen as gay or being seen as weak or just being seen as somehow inadequate.
Yeah, absolutely. Important. Thanks, Micah. So nobody, as you've heard us say, we're all pretty clear that support is critical. Nobody should deal with this experience of abuse without support. There are resources available. I know that Mackenzie shared the link a little earlier to our online resource guide for folks who are looking for support. So, you know, we often hear from people on our helpline who are just beginning to think about getting help or reaching out and wondering what kind of help is available and if it will make a difference. Jackie, I wonder if you have seen folks who have come to you for the very, very first step in their healing process. And do you have any suggestions for people who are just about to embark on that journey of healing and recovery, of seeking out help? And, you know, what can we then tell folks about that? I think you answered some of it earlier. So just, you know, briefly, what can we tell someone who's thinking, I wonder if therapy can help me?
Yeah. Well, I think recognizing that everybody has their own story and therefore their own healing path. So what's going to work for them? And, you know, I know for a lot of people just beginning their process, being in a group just is not a possibility. I think groups can be really incredibly healing at some point along the line, but certainly not for everyone. I think one of the most important things is for survivors to know that they get to control what they do and don't say, not the therapist or anyone else. And just again to emphasize getting support from other survivors, you know, whether it's online, and sometimes that can be really helpful for people who are feeling too feeling that being in a group in person can be too much. I also want to emphasize, we haven't talked yet about the importance of finding healing practices that help address the physiological impact of sexual abuse. So finding ways to heal our bodies. So trauma-informed yoga, trauma-informed mindfulness, Reiki, any form of movement, but all, trauma-informed. I think talk therapy is great, and it's what I do. But I also, with almost all of my clients, I incorporate trauma-informed yoga and mindfulness, quite a variety of mindfulness practices. Because again, not everybody wants to be sitting and breathing on a little cushion. It just doesn't work for everybody. So I think that would be, emphasizing healing our bodies and joining a writing group. And there are writing groups online too that can also be very healing.
Oh, that's so helpful.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, because part of trauma often gets stored in the body too. So not just taking care of, talking about it and healing your mind, but healing those places in your body that, the trauma might be stored in, and finding mindful practices or things that can, make you feel whole is really important. And I honestly think that this leads pretty well into our next question that we often get, which is, how do I tell, or even should I tell someone else? Should I tell my significant other, parent, or my friend about the abuse I experienced as a child? Of course, you can support someone by sharing some of the tips up on your screen. You can help someone set limits on what they're comfortable sharing, and how they can set boundaries for themselves if they decide to have this talk. If a person is planning to talk to a close relative, like a parent, then some folks do find it really helpful to invite them to a therapy session so that they're able to process their loved one's response in real time. While for other folks, having distance between them, like sharing this through a phone call or an email, this feels much more manageable. And so you can help someone come up with an aftercare plan too, after they disclose what they can do, who they can talk to, after they have this conversation. Jackie, is there anything you wanted to add there?
No, I really think you covered it a lot. Yeah.
Okay.
No.
Great, thanks.
That's great, because actually we're probably getting close to the end. And so I'm just going to land here very quickly for our audience, because we know that sometimes part of a survivor's journey is to have some other difficult conversations with maybe the non-offending parent you didn't believe them, maybe with their spouse, or another really important person in their life, and they want them to know what's going on for them. Actually, sometimes we've had questions on our helpline about even talking to the person who abused them as a child. We've put up on the screen a list of some questions, about this right, does this feel right, and what's your objective? And it makes me kind of reflect back, Jackie, on what you were saying, even about the court process, in terms of preparing yourself for the outcome to not be what you had hoped it would be. And so it is definitely a really fragile place, a very courageous place. And I'll probably, as much as I'd like to ask you more about this, again, just being mindful of time, I feel like our mantra is, don't do this alone. Have support. You can practice, you can role play, you can write out what you want to say. And we just want folks to feel like they can choose to have the kind of conversations they want. And again, to really think about the kind of support that they'll have. Yeah. And as we're kind of coming into our last slide, I actually am going to use a question that was in the chat that I think is a really an important question for so many people, about wondering how to help someone who is a survivor who's not doing well, but they don't see themselves as not doing well. And so you don't want to say to them, you're a mess, or your fault, there's problems in your relationship skills or trust, and it's because you're a survivor, and get help. So how can folks who are really caring about survivors in their life, if they're worried about a survivor who isn't, just looks like they could use some support, what do you think we can do? How can we bring this topic up? How can we address that?
Wow.
I know it's a surprise question, but it's our chat question.
No,
so
it's a really good question, and actually making me think of a few people. I think, just as we would do with any friend or family member, if we're concerned, you be just letting them know, you know what, I'm here. And if there are some behavioral things, some real specific things that make you go, yikes, they're in trouble, I can see that they're suffering, you could say, I'm recognizing, I don't know, it seems to me like you're maybe you're drinking a lot, and I'm wondering if it's because things are bothering you, and I'd really like to I want you to know I'm here. Whenever you want to talk, I'm here. And I think the most, sexual abuse is the ultimate disempowerment. So you don't want to do anything that takes away their power or sense of safety. If they're not talking about their sexual abuse, it's because they can't right now. They're not feeling safe. So just keep on being there for them, and and take them out for a walk. Makes them sound like they're anyway. Just to engage with them in life, and let them know you're there.
Yeah, just showing up, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been big on that lately, talking about just showing up. Well,
Exactly.
I really